All right. So the Guardian and the Stream. I'll just kick off. So about a week or so ago, I was reading about the Oregon shooting, as I suppose many of us were. And I'm a pretty standard issue liberal, and when I see things that support my liberal views, I tend to notice them. And so, let's see if this works. Yeah. And so when I see this in an article, my ears perk up. This is from the Christian Science Journal. It says the prevalence of gun ownership in a given state is significantly associated with state incidents of mass killings with firearms, school shootings, et cetera, et cetera. So the blood starts pumping, as it normally does. You know, I'm right. When will the world realize I'm always right? You know, you get this sort of thing from KCD. And a year ago, I think I would have taken this and I would have thrown the link into Twitter or something and tweeted out something snarky like "Thanks Gun Lobby," or blogged something snarky like "For all the following reasons," in the 8 paragraphs following "Thanks Gun Lobby." But for the past year, I've been experimenting with a new social space called Federated Wiki. And it's radically changed how I think about collaboration and communication. So I don't want people to get hung up on the technology angle. I've talked a lot about Federated Wiki over the past year. I think people hear Federated Thingamabob, and they think, oh, well, Mike's talking about a feature of Federated Thingamabob. But I don't think I'm talking about that at all. I think I'm talking about a different way to collaborate, a different way to think about collaboration. Without going too far into what my Federated Wiki journal that I've been keeping is, if you imagine that you have a personal wiki, where instead of tweeting various things and blogging various things, whenever you learn something, you put it in your personal wiki. You just learn something new, you put it in your personal wiki. And you have a variety of other people who are also keeping personal wiki, and when you find something in their wiki that is interesting to you, you link your wiki to theirs, right? That part of the cross-linking and how that works is the federation. So when I see an article like this, I think, well, you know, okay, this would actually be great. I don't really have anything in my personal wiki on gun control. It's time for me to sort of build out my knowledge base on that subject. So I'm going to put this into the, I'm going to put that into the wiki. So I go and I make a page. And the first thing I do is I need to do something we've started to call de-streaming the article. And the idea of this is that this article is very closely tied to a particular event, right, a particular context. And we want to make it more generally usable, because the idea of putting this in the wiki is not that we prove a point about Oregon, right? The idea of putting this in the wiki is this may be a nugget, a fact, a lens that has some sort of future use for us. So I make a page like this. Oh, not like that. Make a page like this. Okay. This is the most basic page I can imagine. It's pretty close to a tweet, and it took me about as much time as a tweet. I think I looked at the revision history of this. I started this page at 6:50. Like the time is really important here. 6:57, and I finished it by 6:58. You know, you take something, you block quote it, paste it in, and you write a short synopsis at the top of what you think this shows. So, you know, I go and I make sure the kids are getting ready for school. I get a cup of coffee. I come back and I think, this is going to be my home page for this idea on my wiki. This is going to be where we put information about mass shooting correlations. So I think I should get a link to this study. The article didn't have a link, so I tracked down the link and I put in a link. And again, I'm doing this because this is a home page for this idea, and a home page for this idea should have a link to the primary material, even if that wasn't in the original article. And again, so far we're not very far off from tweeting, right? So far we're looking at something that is fairly close to a tweet with an embedded block quote. Where it gets different for me is we look now for things to link it to, right? Because we don't want to just say something. We want to connect what we're saying, what we're learning, to the things that we've learned in the past, to the things that other people have learned. So I do a search on, this is on suicide, incidents of suicide. So I do a search on suicide in my wiki, and I find, I find a number of articles in my wiki and other people's wikis as well. You see we have Eisenhower on Sweden here. rising suicide, suicide belts, Swedish suicide myth, which is related to Eisenhower. All comes back to Eisenhower. You know about this whole Swedish suicide myth that turns out it's myth. And it turns out it's actually even worse than myth. Eisenhower said it, and it's a myth, but it's actually also a myth that Eisenhower said it. So it's like a double myth. I get really excited when I see suicide belt, because we're talking about a bunch of states in a correlation with a bunch of states, and there is also a bunch of states, and I remember I wrote this article 6 months ago, there's a bunch of states that have a higher level of suicide, right, in the American West. And so I'm going to link this, I'm going to link the correlations to the suicide belt, and now, I'll really be right, right? So I look at this, and I start to read it, and I realize it's not quite the clean sort of support I was hoping for, right? Because when you look at this and you read it through, which I won't ask you to do, it reminds me that many sociologists believe that the suicide belt is really a result of the demographics of the American West. Suicide of white males is about twice that of black males. The suicide increase that we've seen over the past decade is primarily a white male phenomenon, this rapid increase of suicide. And not surprisingly, one of the theories here is these states in the suicide belt just happen to be states with a lot of single white males in them, and that's why you're seeing the high per capita suicides, right? So I go back to my wiki, and down here at the bottom, this is a thing that kind of developed over time with the way we treat federated wikis. Instead of doing all these middle links and so forth, a lot of times we'll just go to the bottom and we'll say, okay, so what does this article relate to? What are some other things that if you're looking at this you might want to know? So I link this. Most suicides are impulsive because people tend to think of suicide as something that people go through months and months and months, and then finally they hit rock bottom and commit suicide. Actually, that's not true. Most suicides are impulsive, and having access to means like guns is going to up your suicide rate. But I write this sentence. I say suicide incidence is regional, but a confound may be the male whiteness of population. See suicide belt. Right? Now I want you to note how different this sort of meaning is, this sort of meaning making is, from what we often do online and what we generally see on today's web. The excitement here is in building complexity, right? Not in reducing it. More importantly, note how meaning changes here. We probably know what a tweet on this would have meant. We probably know what a blog post on this would have meant. But meaning here is something different. Instead of building an argument about this issue, this attempts to build a model of the issue that can generate new understandings. So I've been working, Ward invented this, Ward invented the first wiki back in 1995. He invented this technology back in 2011. And I just kind of stumbled on Ward's work and said, we should work together and see how we can apply this to education. And he said, yeah. And so we've been doing that. And I've been working on this for about a year and a half. I've been working on this journal. I filled out this journal, been keeping this journal for about a year. And I have, at this point, close to 1,000 articles of my own and other people's in my federated wiki journal. And at that point, where you've mapped out 1,000 articles of your own knowledge, you start to see impacts on your thought that I think are very hard to describe. Over time, you see that these things you write start to form this sort of deep network that helps you think, right? Here's a representation of links to and from a page called On His Side. I'm going to warn you, the next slide is ugly. This is something Ward coded in like an afternoon. I just said, we need I'm giving this keynote. I need a way to show the links to and from so people understand the complexities. You say, okay, I'll build it. But you build it in the way that Ward does, which is like, do you know Ward Cunningham? He's also one of the proponents of Agile. So everything has to be the absolute simplest possible way, right? So shield your eyes. What this is so there's this article I have about Kandinsky. It's called On His Side, and Kandinsky. It's just something I heard that I thought I'd put in the wiki. Kandinsky came up with the idea of abstract art when he walked in to his studio, and he saw this beautiful painting. Right, it's sitting. This gorgeous painting that doesn't represent anything. You know, it's just these sweeps of color and these swaths and these shapes and this geometry. And he's like, what is this gorgeous painting? And then he realizes, oh, it's a painting of a street scene that's on its side that I did last week. Yeah, so that was an interesting story about creativity. And so I put this on its side in there. Now, what's interesting about this is that's just something I put in, I don't know when, 5, 6 months ago. You can see the links out here. So the links on the links going this way, this is links one step out. So on its side, links to Circles in a Circle, Haiku by a Robot. Do you guys know Haiku by a Robot? Guys, yeah. Discovered by a 9-year-old kid and sent into Highlights magazine. And it goes, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It goes 710, 711, 712. It's Haiku by a Robot. You might ask Clint, who's many things, but she actually invented abstract art long before Kandinsky. So you see that that's the first level of links going forward. These are the links from those links. And so we look and we see basics of ASCII art, number poem for 2 voices, a page on found art, Stravinsky's Player Piano, right? This is network. And if we go back to things that link in that we didn't know, we can go back 2 spaces here and we'll find Killer Bob, right? And Killer Bob is the story of, you guys know Twin Peaks, right? I'm not that old yet, right? Okay, so Twin Peaks, David Lynch is filming Twin Peaks, and they don't have a villain yet, really. They don't know who killed Laura Palmer. And this prop guy gets in the shot in a mirror, right? There's just a flicker of in the mirror, and they're like, okay, we've got to redo the shot. The prop guy's in the mirror. He's looking, he's like, that's really kind of creepy. You know, and so he talks to the prop guy and whatever, and they make him a character, and he becomes Killer Bob, you know, who is in the background of all these shots, but never quite in the foreground, right? You know, what does this mean? What does this network mean? I don't know. I look at something like this, and I've got a sense that there's a sort of meaning here that's created that resists reduction in a way that I really like, and in a way that I get really excited about, because once we reduce meaning into a sort of a rhetoric, into an argument, all those pieces are welded in a way that can't generate new understandings. But these pieces are still free to generate those new understandings. I'm deviating so much from the script, I'm going to have to find where I am. But, you know, this is the way you get. It's all tangential, right? Weirdly, these links were all compiled over the space of the year. I didn't sit down and say, you know, this issue of found art and this issue of reverse creativity, I'm going to just research a bunch of this. You know, Killer Bob happened during one of the FedWiki happenings we had in January. Kandinsky happened, I think, over the summer. Basics of ASCII art happened before we even ran a happening. This Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, which is some computer-generated poetry of the 1980s. I can't even remember when that happened, but I could look at the revision history. Weirdly, just tying things together, I created a wiki on issues of found art in reverse creativity without even intending to do it. It just happened. And as I go through this, I do just want to say, I'm talking here about connecting my things together because I don't want to get into some of the technical details of how we find other things and fork other things. But you can imagine, a lot of these things are actually pulled from other people. Actually, the Auger Trouve one was not written by me. That was something else that I pulled in that, for some reason, I thought linked to, I think, Haiku by a Robot, right? So this federated wiki browser that we're looking here actually shows across the network the relationship between these different ideas that people have recorded. All right, let's figure out where I am in this thing. So this experience has radically changed me. To the point I find it hard sometimes to communicate with other technologists. And there's sort of this running joke that Jim Groom and Tim Owens, is Jim here yet? No, Jim's not here. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Jim. Have that every time I talk, it's like the Matrix. I'm like, here's the red pill, here's the blue pill. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating. But this is my attempt. This talk is my attempt to abstract from this experience something more general about the way in which we collaborate now, in the way in which I think that what we're using in technology has become out of balance. This is not to denigrate what we currently do. This is simply to say that the way in which we collaborate has gotten out of balance, and it's time to return some of that balance to it. I don't know how many of you are convinced, but I'll take what I can get here. So, to talk about this effectively, I'd like to introduce two terms. There are terms that representing different approaches to the web, different approaches to network knowledge. The garden and the stream, each of these terms has a history that predates me, but we're going to tweak the terms a little for our own purposes. Here we go. The garden is an old metaphor associated with hypertext. If you know the history, you know this. Mid-20th century, garden of forking paths. The idea of the wiki gardener from the 1990s. Mark Bernstein's 1998 Hypertext Gardens essay. And the garden is the web as topology, okay? It's the web as space. It's the integrative web, okay? The iterative web, the web as arrangement and rearrangement of one thing to another. Things in the garden don't collapse to a single set of relations or to a canonical sequence. And that's part of what we mean when we say the web as topology or the web as space. Every walk through the garden Every walk through the garden, what? Every walk through the garden creates new paths, new meanings. And when we add things into the garden, we add them in a way that allows for those new meanings to develop, allows for future unpredicted relationships. We can see this in this view here. This is a picture of a bridge in Portland's Japanese gardens. And it's, it's the same bridge from different approaches, different seasons. And the idea here is that a bridge is a bridge is a bridge. It's a defined thing. It has, maybe a stated purpose, given boundaries. But the multilinear nature of the garden means that there's no one right view of the bridge. There's no one right use of the bridge. That we actually have to, there's no one correct approach. The architect creates the bridge, but it's the visitors to the park, right, that ultimately create the meaning of the bridge as they wander through that. And a good bridge supports many approaches, many views, many seasons, maybe many uses. And the meaning of the bridge will evolve even for the architect over time. In the garden, to ask what happened first is kind of a trivial question at best. I mean, the bridge doesn't reply to the trees don't reply to the bridge. They bear a relationship to one another. But it's not really a time-bound relationship. And this is true of everything in the garden. Every leaf, tree, vine, lamppost is seen in relationship to the garden as a whole, but at the same time, there are no single defined relationships. It's not a case of a statement and response. In the garden is what I was doing in the wiki when I added the gun control article, building out this network of often conflicting information into a web that can generate insights and iterating it, allowing it to grow into something bigger than a single event, something bigger than a single narrative, something bigger than a single meaning. The stream is a newer metaphor, but has old roots. So we can think of the event stream of programming, right? The life stream that researchers defined in the mid-90s. More recently, the term has been applied to that never-ending parade of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, so forth. In the stream metaphor, you don't experience the stream by walking around. The stream's not topology. You get in the stream, and the stream kind of flows past you, right? You get hit by things within your own stream. And it's not that you're passive in the stream either. I don't want to give any impression that the stream is a passive space. You're feeding off things. You have your @replies. You have your posts. You have your various mentions, forum contents. But they exist in a context that's collapsed down to a stream of meaning, right? In other words, the stream replaces topology with serialization. So rather than imagine a timeless world of connection, multiple paths, the stream presents us with a time-ordered path, with our experience, and really only our experience, if we don't watch out, at the center. So we interpret things in the stream on the basis of how those things have occurred and how they reply or respond to things that we have done. in many ways, I think the stream is best seen through the lens of Bakhtin's idea of the utterance. You know, Bakhtin saw the utterance, the conversational turn of speech is inextricably linked to context. I mean, to understand what something meant, you had to go back, you had to understand what it was responding to, what that was responding to. You had to follow it back. You had to reconstruct the context of the person saying it. In essence, you had to reconstruct the stream of the person saying it to understand what it meant, right? To understand your statement, I really have to reconstruct your stream. If you look at a lot of misunderstandings online, this is where a lot of them tend to be. Whereas the garden is integrative, the stream is self-assertive, its persuasion, its argument, its advocacy, is personalized and personalized and immediate. It's also extremely invigorating, right? But as we may see in a minute, I think it's profoundly unsuited to some of the uses that we try to put it. Okay. The stream is what I do on Twitter and blogging platforms. I take a fact and project it out. It's another brick in an argument or a narrative or a persona that I build over time. I recapitulate instead of iterate, and there's a difference there. Okay, I'm going to assume most people in the room have read Vannevar Bush's 1945 essay, As We May Think. Is that correct? And you may learn something here that it's actually not Vannevar, it's Vannevar. I actually have to put Vannevar on my notes here because old habits. If you haven't read As We May Think, I envy you. I mean, you have a wonderful experience ahead of you. I think reading that article, I read that article before the web, something my dad handed me, and it blew me away. I actually, before I read As We May Think, I was an English major, right? I was interested in linguistics, and I had never thought of technology, which my dad did it for a living, as a philosophical space. And that article just blew my mind. And it was one of the things that later on, when it turned out, there were more jobs in technology than discourse linguistics. It turned out I was excited about that fact. I was excited about that fact. So for me, it's also a very personal moment, that article. Now, when people talk about Bush's article, they're normally talking about Section 6, which seems to forecast, everything that happened with the web. This is an article from 1945, of course. He talks about this Memex. And we actually don't need the sound on this. But this Memex is a desk. How many people, just so I know, how many people are familiar with As We May Think in the Memex? Oh, you guys, we got the smartest people in the world here. Good. Well, I'm going to remind you, though, because what I find is that I had a certain idea of this article. From reading it before the web, seeing the web evolve, the idea that this is the realization of the Memex. And when I go back to this article, I find it's a little different than I remember. So he says the owner of the Memex, let us say, is interested in the origin and properties of the bow and arrow. He's talking about a researcher using the Memex. So specifically, he's studying why the short Turkish bow was apparently superior to the English longbow in the skirmishes of the Crusades. He has dozens of possibly pertinent books and articles in the Memex. First, he runs through the encyclopedia, finds an interesting but sketchy article, leaves it projected. Next, in the history, he finds another pertinent item and throws it up on that other screen, right? Occasionally, he inserts a comment of his own. That's an interesting thing right there. Either linking it to the main trail or joining it by a side trail to a particular item. When it becomes evident that the elastic properties of available materials had a great deal to do with the bow, he branches off onto a side trail, which takes him through textbooks on elasticity and tables of physical constants. And that's another interesting thing, too. There's a web of data and text, which I find fascinating. He inserts a page of longhand analysis on his own. Then he builds a trail of his interest through the maze of materials available to him. And at the risk of, whenever you jump off to YouTube, it's always such a horrible experience in conference, isn't it? But let's see if we can. Where did that go? The Memex, folks. You know what? We don't need it. We don't know. You guys are smart. You guys know what the Memex is. So, the story we hear is that this is the original vision of the web. It certainly was the inspiration for the pioneers of hypertext. And Nelson said that he heard it as a child. Engelbart read it as a soldier in World War II out in the Pacific, just after the first atomic bomb had dropped. It was a huge influence. But in reality, it doesn't predict the web at all, right? The web actually works nothing like this. You know, it's weird because in our minds it does. But let's look at some of the attributes of the memex, right? Your machine is a library, right? Not a publication device. It's a library. You have documents in there that you control directly, copies of documents that you can annotate, change, add links to, summarize, because the memex is a tool to think with, right? Not to publish. And this is crucial to our talk here because these abilities to link, annotate, change, summarize, copy, these are the verbs of gardening. Each memex library contains both the original materials, your own original materials, and the materials of others. So this little thing right here is a scanner, right? You go over there, you write something out longhand, or you type it up, and you scan it in, and it's just another page in the memex. It's a first-class citizen of that web. There's no distinction between your materials and the materials that you pull from other places. The links are associative, right? This is a huge deal. Links are not only a way to quickly share something. They aren't a way to say, hey, here's something interesting. They aren't a way to say, here's the people that have had this conversation that I'm continuing. They're a way to show connections that the reader might not see as immediately evident, like a bit of a tickler as you read the article. And links are made by readers as well as writers, right? So in the Vannevar Bush vision, the author doesn't get to decide what the thing links to. I mean, they can make an initial pass at that, and he talks about these things being pre-shipped with some links. But the major linking activity is going to be from the readers of the memex as they go through it, and in their experience reading, they see that there are connections to other things that they can add. Okay. He goes further, of course, and he talks about okay, so now this person who's looked at the longbow and the physics of the longbow is talking to a friend of his and says, his friend says, oh, I'm looking at innovation, or resistance to innovation. And the person who's made this trail says, oh, I was looking at the longbow the other day, right? And it's kind of like that. I was going through the physics of that, but, you know, here. And he goes, and there's this little thing up here. Where's the lever? There's this little lever up here called the duplicator. And he goes to his memex, and he hits that duplicator, and it goes and it makes a copy of everything along those trails. And he takes out the little microfilm, which is now a copy of all his links, all his notes, all his annotations, and he hands it to the friend, right? And now the friend puts that in his memex. It makes his notes and builds out his network of things, right? Is that how the web works today? I don't know. Maybe if it is how it works for you, we need to hang out. I'm blown away by the vision of this every time I read it. And lately, it's not that I'm blown away by how much it predicts the future, but by the fact we haven't achieved this yet. That all these years later is something we haven't achieved, and I don't even think that we've made a serious attempt to move towards it. And there's a substance to this vision that you can't help but long for after reading it. There's a substance, right? Note that the connections here are not banter, right? But they're a construction of the mental model of a domain. You know? I don't know. It blows me away. To my mind, it's kind of the ultimate garden. It's pre-networked. And thinking about how a network works with that is the question we'll talk about next. So, you know, we didn't end up with this. You know, what happened? I had a long narrative in this section. Story moved between the well and Dave Weiner and mailing this and Jordan Barger's epic goodbye to the Kate Bush News Group, which is actually a huge moment in the history of blogging. Maybe we can have an outtake section that captures that, or maybe the outtake section is beers. Maybe it's beers, whether you like it or not. But I'll boil it down to this. It came down to who had the power to change things. Right? It came down to who had the right to make copies. On the web, if you wanted to read something, wow, this seems much shorter than I thought. In the web, if you wanted to read something, you had to read it on someone else's server, where you couldn't copy it, you couldn't annotate it, you couldn't add outgoing links to it, right? These are the verbs of gardening, and they were unavailable on the early web, right? Because we had a server-based permissions, where a document was. The idea of a document on the web is its location. Think about the meaning of that for a minute. But what a server-centric web is really good at is distributed conversation. So a bunch of people frustrated by Usenet and mailing lists and BBS and all the way that those things tended not to scale very well, realized this, and they created something that was half hypertext and half sort of BBS culture, you know. And we called it blogging initially, and then it sort of bloomed. Blogging was the prototypical stream. When they added syndication to that, that became something amazing. It was a beautiful marriage of hypertext and BBS. So in 2006, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, take this model of you have a page. This page is sort of your stream of your events. It is mixed into a syndicated aggregation of what all the people you follow do. And this became the main way that we consume the web, right? So whether it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, whatever, a lot of people say blogging is dead. I say that that is exactly backwards, that everything is blogging now. You know, blogging won, and by winning, it became invisible. So we see it develop into the web as we know it today. And at its worst, it can be a web of, hey, this is cool, one-hop links, right? A web where links are used to create a conversation. This is not at its worst, but links are used to create a conversational trail. If you think about links in blogging are defining who you're in conversation with. You spend the first paragraph or so saying, so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said this. You're kind of reconstructing, you're back constructing your email thread, right? But you get to decide who's in that conversation, which is also kind of a fraught thing. And so this is where the web comes from today. The conversational web, a web obsessed with arguing points, a web as a tool for self-expression, which can be great, but rather than a tool for thought, right? A web where you weld information and data into your arguments so they can't be repurposed against you. The web not as a reconfigurable model of understanding, but sort of as a sequence of sealed shut presentations. In a web that can be beautiful, and still is beautiful in so many ways. But it's an incomplete experience, and it's time we fix that. So what's the big picture here? Why am I so obsessed with the integrative garden, and the personal and self-assertive web, and blogs killed hypertext, but who cares, Mike, etc. And often that is the reaction. Yeah, some of you actually are the people that have said that. I think we've been stuck in some unuseful binaries over the years, or perhaps some binaries that maybe have outlived their use. And what I'm asking you to do is to put aside your favorite sort of binaries, your favorite dichotomies for a moment, and try out this garden versus the stream dichotomy. Now, all dichotomies are fictions. You guys know this, right? Some are useful and some are not. And some are useful for a while and then they're no longer useful. I just want you to see if the garden versus the stream, the point of this talk, is this a useful dichotomy? Is this a tool we can think with? So, you know, I'll start with OER. I've been involved with OER for a very long time. You know, it's actually kind of telling. It's OER, and there's nothing up there because we can't find the resource we want. We announced a textbook. We announced a textbook initiative at my school like 2 weeks ago, open textbook initiative. One of the first people to email me said she taught state and local government, and she was so excited about it. She's like, let's find a text. And I knew there wouldn't be a state and local government. It's a federal government text I know about, but I knew there wouldn't be a state and local government textbook. But I thought, there'll be some materials out there. There'll be some resources. So I said, give me your syllabus, and we'll look through your syllabus, and we'll map that out to some of the available resources. So I go and I look for these resources, and the things she needs are things like the influence of local subsidies on development, stuff like that. Now, if you go and you Google that term, how many sites in the top 50 will you find just offering a clear and balanced treatment of what that is, what the recent trends are with it, and what seems to be driving those trends, right? And the answer is zero. You'll find zero things in the top 50. And maybe they exist somewhere result 236 or something. But everything else is journal articles or blog posts, making specific points about specific policies in a specific context, talking to a specific audience, right? Building rapport with that audience, embedded in specific conversations, specific objectives. You know, everybody wants to play in the stream, but nobody wants to build the garden, right? Our traditional binary here has been open versus closed, but honestly, I don't think that's the most interesting question to me anymore. I know why textbook companies are closed. They want to make money. And that's kind of there's no great sort of eternal mystery about that. What's harder for me to understand is how in nearly 25 years of the web, when people have told us what they think about local subsidies approximately 1 cajillion times, we can't find one syllabus-ready treatment of that subject. If you want ethics of network knowledge, think about that for a minute. How much time we spent arguing and promoting our ideas, and how little time we spent contributing to the general pool of knowledge. How little time we spent constructing the step stools that would allow other people into our conversation. Why? Because we're infatuated with the stream. We're infatuated with our own voice. We're infatuated with the argument we're in, the point we're trying to make, the people we're talking to. People say, well, Wikipedia. Look at Wikipedia. And yes, exactly, Wikipedia, okay? There's 1 billion people posting what they think about crap on Facebook, right? Like 1 billion. That's not hyperbole. There's like literally 1 billion, okay? There's 31,000 active Wikipedians that hold English Wikipedia together. 31,000. That's essentially, I looked it up, if you take faculty, staff, students at Stanford, that's the population of Stanford, right? Holding Wikipedia together for the entire English-speaking world. 1 billion, 31,000. I think we should be ashamed. I think we should be really, like, when I look at that, it's not like, wow, that's an opportunity. It's just shame. It's just shame. 25 years into the web, and here's where we are. Learning design. This brings us to learning design. Dave Cormier had an interesting point a month ago about how every we makes a them. You get a large class together in fragments, partially to protect itself from scale, right? Cliques develop, the cool kids table emerges. And the cool kids say, well, we're not cool kids, we just like to sit together. You know? That's what the cool kids table is. You know, you don't, like, there's a sort of, I don't know. It's hard to recognize when it's you, I guess. Others complain they're not being attended to, right? It's interesting to me that we assume so much online interaction is about conversation via blogging, tweeting, commenting, and only about conversation. We assume this is the way that things must be, that every we does create a them. The we and the them is built into the logic of the stream. As I said in blogging, what you're doing at the beginning of that blog is you're saying, I'm going to write something. Let me tell you who I think is in the conversation I'm having. You know, the minute you do that, you say who is in the conversation you're having, and you're saying who is not. And a bunch of people in the MOOC, they look at your definition of who's in that conversation like, I said something about it. Why am I not in this? Like, who eliminated me from the email thread? That's weird. And they get upset. But part of it is that we're in that stream. We have to collapse that to some stream of narrative. So-and-so said this, and so-and-so said this, and now I'm saying this in response. You know? And when we do that, under that compression, we kind of do violence to the history. But where are the cool kids in the memex? In the Vannevar Bush scenario. Now, I'm sure they're there. I'm not naive. You know, someone gets linked more than someone else, maybe unfairly, and we know that sort of thing happens. But compared to blogging, which is so personality and conversation driven, I can't help but wonder if a garden approach could possibly be a little more inclusive, or at least a little less painfully lonely for the people that just don't get mentioned in the reconstructed thread. Kate, who graced us with her presence in the FedWiki happenings, had a metaphor she liked for the learning environment of what we're calling gardeners here. She talked about studio space, right? So this idea that you're working next to people in a building, you're kind of looking outside the corner of your eye at what people are doing, right? In your work, what you're working on reacts to what they're doing in this really personal way. You know, we think we need conversation to have this sort of connection, but you build connection in a number of ways. So it's also about getting back to this idea that our personal learning network isn't just about our Twitter followers, but it's also about connecting our work together. You know, not just the list of people that we connect. You know, I see this thing with the PLN, and people talk about the PLN as if it's, oh, well, I have all these Twitter followers, and I follow them, and that's my PLN. Oh, okay. I don't know. That's not what I thought we were talking about early on, but maybe I was wrong. And then finally, tools, right? So I know there's some people that do tools here. They're tool designers. And I'm not quite sure where to put this. But I've talked about this tool, Federated Wiki, for a year and a half, and people have nodded and said, oh, okay, Mike's likes this piece of software he's working on called Federated Wiki. But what Federated Wiki to me is the Dynabook. It's like Alan Kay's Dynabook. It's the crazy crap that you see if you'd walked into Xerox PARC in 1977. And it's, you know, in that way, it's kind of a bit of a mess. But I think you'll see some of its solutions in other stuff in 10 years, right? So stuff like documents that choose proliferation over centralization. Like, don't be scared of proliferation. Proliferation is actually how biology solves the problem of adaptability, right? You know, perfect copies in life on Earth does not exist. Stuff like paragraph and page level forking, edit and fork trails, link resolution context that build off those trails, page items as JSON, all that stuff. But I'm here to tell you, if you're a tool builder, I'm not here to tell you to use Federated Wiki, but I'm just asking, you know, maybe don't build us another stream. Maybe the like $10 billion we've spent building 8,000 streams over the past 10 years, you know, maybe we could apply it to some other sorts of, you know, experiences. You know, so, yeah. And funders, I mean, I'll just make a pitch here. Having been an OER for so long, like, tools matter. Like, you know, it's nice to have content and it's nice to put together, you know, all this stuff. But if we could build environments that really encourage people to share their knowledge rather than to have, you know, conversations that lock people out, and we could fund those sorts of tools, I think we'd see a lot of progress. So I could go into other examples, right? But I think it's probably more productive and efficient to let you all see if this metaphor, oh, what's that? Interesting. You know what? Well, these are more networks of ideas. It's more interesting to let you guys think about how this metaphor could let you reconceptualize your own challenges. And I hope it does, right? We come to this question of whether we're at a turning point. Are we seeing a shift in this? And it's always dangerous to ask an activist to forecast something because, you know, if the forecast is like, no, it's not going to happen, you'd just give up, right? So let me try not to slip into wishful analysis here. But there are a couple things I see, right? 2015, out of nowhere, we saw web annotation, which has had such a struggle breaking into the mainstream. Suddenly, people use web annotation. People get web annotation. The Keynote long explanation you used to have to do about delicious is now turned into an elevator pitch for genius, you know? That's interesting, right? GitHub has taught a generation of programmers that copies are good, you know, that we don't have to fear proliferation, that actually fork away, it actually builds a stronger network. Wikimedia Education Project has been convincing teachers there's life beyond student reflection projects, right? From my own perspective, this project I'm working on made 0 sense to people even 2 years ago. You'll tell me after this, you know, how far we've moved the needle on that. But I feel like it's resonated with people at least a little better than it did. And there's a lot of stuff I cut out of this talk about cross-institutional collaboration, the stream and exclusion, garden, and integrative education. So I hope you'll ask me those things either in a couple minutes or over the next few days. I'll leave you with this. I think we can imagine a world, I think, so much better than this one if only we can get our heads out of the stream for a bit and build the garden we need. So I want to talk about how to do that. So thank you. Oh.
So we have about 8 or 9 minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments or fruit they'd like to throw? Anybody? Come on. Uh-oh. Can I have somebody other than Jim Groom?
Mike, I'm sorry I was late to your talk. I'm a really big fan. But we have had this conversation ongoing for a long time. And one of the things that I've struggled with the smallest better wiki and some of the things you're talking about is the notion of you talk about how important technology is in relationship to the OER.
Yeah.
And usable, functional, kind of friendly technology.
Yeah, yeah.
And as much as I love the way you compare Vannevar Bush to the notion, I'm sorry, I said it wrong, to the notion of the web and how it maybe is a good analogy for the Smallest Federated Wiki. Smallest Federated Wiki as a technology is still very hard for people to use and to wrap their head around that idea. And so how do you kind of balance that struggle of something you are trying to kind of propose as an alternative, yet at the same time we know the adoption is fueled by a stream-based model that makes it easy?
Yeah. So, you know, at the risk of sounding grandiose, it will sound grandiose. I don't mean, I'm not making this analogy at the level of the analogy, but just the qualitative nature of it. You know, no one ever released the Dynabook. You know, people didn't walk around with Dynabooks, right? I mean, you know, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs came in and mercilessly reduced that experience at Xerox PARC into something they felt they could sell, right? And I think, you know, working with Ward, I think I've realized that in Ward's mind, what he wants to show is he doesn't want to delete any of the possibilities. He wants the possibilities there, completely open. And what that's allowed us to do over the past year is watch how people actually use this product. And I think after a year of watching people use this open project, where, as you know, you can build anything. I mean, it's an amazingly configurable product, but it doesn't really push you in a certain direction. I think I'm not like announcing something here, but I'm looking at exploring, are there ways that we could use something like WordPress, you know, for example, to simulate some of this functionality that gave people a way into this where they don't have to learn the entire new technology. Now, that would mean that we have to, you know, cut a lot of what's possible now out of that product. But for those here that may have participated in some of the FedWiki happenings, that was what the happenings were about, is to see, okay, when people do this, what do they actually do? One thing we found out that I didn't predict at all was that people actually don't edit each other's articles much, right? What people do is they leave annotations at the bottom of the article. They don't even go and add links in the article. They just say at the bottom of the article, you know, this reminds me of this, this reminds me of this. And so you get to a situation, if you can let that go and you can say, well, people have documents, but anybody is allowed to add annotations, well, now we've reduced the complexity of that problem, and we can start to look at something. So I would say over the next year, I do want to come up with something that's streamlined where you know, a relatively technology literate user could jump into something like the Federation and start doing that. So if you want to partner on that, we can partner on that.
So we have about, oh, is there another question? We got time for one more, but it's got to be an easier question than Jim Groom asked.
So you said 31 billion, sorry, 1 billion using Facebook versus 31,000.
Yeah.
But you said, I mean, a lot of crap on Facebook, good stuff on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
And so why should we be ashamed of that?
Well, the idea of Wikipedia, I think, Wikipedia ends up being, and I'll be super short, but Wikipedia ends up being the excuse for all this, because people say, there's an article on that on Wikipedia. And so everything's okay. Well, I don't think it's okay. I think the Vannevar Bush example, I think the initial vision was we'll have hundreds, dozens, thousands of articles on the same thing. And that actually is going to preserve a diversity of vision and allow us to move forward as we know. When we have just one article, and it's the only article, I think we radically compress. You know, I think we radically compress the view of that subject, right? So I want a world of I love Wikipedia. I want a world of 1 million Wikipedias.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. I think when we look at what Mike's talking about, one of the main messages there is the maintaining of complexity inside of the discussions that we're having. And that's really the vision that we have for this conference and for the discussions that are here past the conference. Hopefully that as they continue on, as we try to keep addressing these issues over the next couple of years.